It was a crisp winter evening in the heart of New York City. The streets glittered with the reflections of city lights, and the air buzzed with the energy of luxury. Inside one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, the atmosphere was nothing short of magical. The soft hum of violins filled the room, blending with the low murmur of elite conversations and the occasional clinking of crystal glasses. Everything about the place screamed perfection, wealth, and power. Amidst the grandeur, the spotlight fell on Victoria Grant, a name whispered with both admiration and fear in boardrooms across the globe. Draped in an exquisite designer gown, her presence alone seemed to command attention. Victoria was the embodiment of success, a self-made billionaire with an unshakable confidence and an air of superiority that kept everyone at a distance. Tonight was no ordinary evening for her. It was a celebration of her latest triumph, a multi-million-dollar deal that would only solidify her place at the top. But just outside the restaurant's glowing doors, a very different story was unfolding. A small boy stood shivering in the bitter cold, his clothes tattered, his cheeks flushed red from the biting wind. His name was Ethan, and while no one inside the restaurant gave him a second glance, his determined eyes stayed fixed on the scene within. Clutching a crumpled piece of paper in his trembling hands, he stared at the bustling dining room as if this was his last chance at something he couldn't afford to lose. Ethan wasn't there by accident. For weeks he had been waiting for this moment, gathering the courage to step through those doors. His heart raced as he replayed the words in his head. The warning he needed to deliver, the truth no one inside that opulent room could have anticipated. Little did anyone know, the boy standing on the fringes of their world held the power to shatter their comfort and expose a danger far greater than the warmth of their wine or the glow of their chandeliers could mask. What Ethan was about to do would shake the very foundation of that perfect evening, leaving everyone in the room speechless, and one woman's life changed forever. The heavy wooden doors of the grand restaurant loomed before Ethan, almost daring him to enter. He hesitated for a moment, the biting wind at his back, and the dazzling warmth of the restaurant spilling out in front of him. His small, trembling hand pressed against the door. With a deep breath, he pushed it open. A rush of warmth hit him instantly. The luxurious glow of chandeliers illuminated the polished marble floors. The soft hum of violins filled the air, and the rich aroma of gourmet meals wafted toward him. Inside, perfectly dressed patrons were seated at tables adorned with crystal glasses and candles. The chatter and laughter of the elite bounced off the walls, creating an air of effortless indulgence. But as Ethan stepped inside, everything stopped. Heads turned, forks paused midair, and an uncomfortable silence began to ripple through the room. Whispers spread like wildfire, and eyes darted toward the boy who didn't belong. His tattered clothes, scuffed shoes, and dirt-streaked face stood out like a stain on the restaurant's pristine image. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his gaze fixed. His hands clutched the crumpled piece of paper tighter as he scanned the room, searching for her. The woman he had come for, the one who held the power to change everything tonight. At a corner table, Victoria Grant sat surrounded by quiet admiration and whispered deference. Her gown sparkled under the warm glow of the lights, and her every gesture was calculated and poised. She noticed the boy instantly, her sharp eyes narrowing with irritation. This was her night, a celebration of power and triumph, and she wouldn't allow anything or anyone to ruin it. With a quick wave of her hand, Victoria summoned the maitre d'. Her voice, though quiet, carried an authority that demanded immediate action. "Can someone please deal with this? This isn't a soup kitchen," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. The maitre d', dressed impeccably in a crisp black suit, approached Ethan with a firm expression. The boy, already feeling the weight of disapproving stares, took a step back. But then something shifted in him. The fear he felt moments ago gave way to determination. His eyes, wide and nervous, locked on Victoria. He raised his hand, stopping the maitre d' in his tracks. His voice trembled, but the urgency in it couldn't be ignored. "Please," he said loud enough for the room to hear. "I need to talk to her. It's urgent." Gasps and murmurs spread through the room like an electric current. The audacity of this boy, interrupting such an exclusive gathering, was unthinkable. Patrons exchanged glances, their faces a mix of curiosity and indignation. Victoria raised a perfectly arched eyebrow, her irritation now mingled with intrigue. She leaned back in her chair, studying the boy as if he were a puzzle that didn't quite fit. Her lips curved into a faint, mocking smile. "Fine," she said, her tone dismissive but commanding enough to silence the entire room. "Speak quickly, boy. You have 30 seconds." Ethan stepped forward cautiously, every pair of eyes in the room fixed on him. His voice cracked as he tried to steady his nerves. "Please, don't eat that meal," he blurted out. The room froze. A heavy silence fell over the crowd as every eye shifted between the boy and Victoria. She tilted her head slightly, the faint amusement on her face disappearing as confusion took its place. "Excuse me," she asked, her voice low and deliberate. Ethan swallowed hard, his small frame trembling but refusing to back down. "It's poisoned," he said, his words clear and firm this time. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Waiters stopped mid-step, guests leaned forward in their seats, and the tension in the air became almost unbearable. Victoria's face hardened. For the first time that evening, her confident composure faltered. Her sharp gaze bore into the boy, searching for any sign of deceit or desperation. "Are you insane?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "Who sent you?" "Nobody sent me," Ethan replied, his voice gaining strength. "I overheard the man in the kitchen. He said someone wanted to hurt you, someone who doesn't want you to leave this restaurant alive." Whispers erupted across the room. The air was thick with disbelief, fear, and curiosity. A waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes stumbled, nearly dropping them, as the weight of the moment pressed down on everyone. Victoria held up a hand, silencing the whispers. Her piercing gaze remained locked on Ethan, her mind racing. Was this a desperate cry for attention? A cruel joke? Or was there something more behind this boy's sudden warning? Ethan took a shaky step forward, his small frame dwarfed by the opulence of the room. His voice trembled but carried a sense of urgency that could not be ignored. "Please," he said, his eyes locking onto Victoria's, "don't eat that meal. It's poisoned." The air in the restaurant froze, as if time itself had stopped. Forks clattered against plates, and a wave of gas rippled through the room. All at once, the murmurs of disapproval turned into whispers of shock and confusion. Victoria's sharp eyes narrowed, her face a mix of irritation and disbelief. The boy's audacity was almost laughable. Her perfectly manicured fingers tightened around the stem of her wineglass as she slowly set it down on the table. "Are you insane?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Who sent you? Is this some kind of joke?" Ethan shook his head vigorously, his hands trembling as he gripped the crumpled piece of paper in his pocket. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room bearing down on him, but he stood firm. "Nobody sent me," he said, his voice breaking but resolute. "I overheard a man in the kitchen. He was talking about you. He said your success has made you enemies. And tonight, someone wants to make sure you never leave this restaurant alive." The guests exchanged nervous glances, their whispered conversations growing louder with each passing second. A waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes stumbled, nearly dropping the entire tray as the tension in the air became almost unbearable. Victoria's eyes bore into the boy, her mind racing. Was this a stunt? A desperate cry for attention? Or was there a grain of truth in his words? Her heart, though rarely swayed by emotion, skipped a beat at the boy's unwavering gaze. There was something about his voice, his conviction, that tugged at a part of her she thought she had buried long ago. "You overheard?" she repeated, her tone skeptical but no longer dismissive. "And why should I believe anything you're saying?" Ethan hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an anchor. His hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. This was his moment, his one chance to be heard. "Because I saw him," Ethan said, his voice growing louder. "He was holding a vial. He said it would be quick, that you'd barely feel it. He laughed about how nobody would suspect him. Please, you have to believe me." The room fell into an eerie silence. Victoria's guests, once engrossed in their private conversations, were now leaning forward in their seats, their faces pale with fear. One man, seated at a nearby table, whispered to his companion, "Do you think this is real? Should we be worried?" The maître d', who had been frozen in place, stepped forward cautiously. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Victoria, "if this young man's claim has any merit, perhaps we should—" "Silence!" Victoria snapped, cutting him off. Her voice was sharp, but her expression betrayed the cracks in her composure. Her gaze returned to Ethan, scrutinizing every detail of his face. The boy was trembling, his cheeks flushed from the effort of standing his ground, but his eyes held no trace of deception, only raw, unfiltered desperation. "And what do you expect me to do, boy?" Victoria asked, her voice quieter now, but still laced with skepticism. "Stop them," Ethan said, his voice soft but resolute. "Check the kitchen. Find him before it's too late. Please, I know what I heard. If you don't believe me, people could get hurt." Victoria studied him for what felt like an eternity. The weight of the room bore down on her, the silence pressing against her ears. Finally, she exhaled, her decision made. "Fine," she said, rising from her chair. Her presence, always commanding, now felt like a force of nature. She turned to the maitre d' and gestured toward the kitchen. "Nobody touches anything until we've checked. Bring the head chef out here, now." The maitre d' nodded quickly, his expression a mix of fear and determination. He disappeared into the kitchen, leaving the room suspended in anxious anticipation. Ethan stood frozen, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He had done what he came to do, but the enormity of the moment weighed on him. All he could do now was wait. Victoria's voice broke through the tension as she addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I assure you this matter will be resolved swiftly. Please remain seated and refrain from consuming anything until further notice." The murmurs grew louder, guests exchanging worried glances. A woman near the back clutched her husband's arm, her voice trembling. "What if the boy is telling the truth? What if we're all in danger?" Victoria ignored the rising panic, her focus solely on the kitchen doors. Moments later, the maitre d' returned with the head chef, his face pale and his hands trembling. Behind him, another man, a sous chef, lingered in the shadows. Ethan's eyes widened as recognition flooded through him. He pointed a shaky finger at the sous chef. "That's him," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "That's the man I heard." The room erupted in gasps and whispers as the sous chef froze in place, his face a mask of fear. Victoria's expression darkened, her icy composure replaced with a smoldering fury. "Bring him here," she commanded, her voice like steel. Security guards moved swiftly, grabbing the sous chef by the arms and dragging him into the center of the room. The tension was unbearable, the air thick with fear and anticipation. As the sous chef stood trembling before Victoria, the truth began to unravel, and the perfect evening spiraled into chaos. Victoria stood abruptly, the sharp scrape of her chair cutting through the tense silence. Her piercing gaze swept over the restaurant staff and then landed on Ethan. Her towering presence seemed to fill the room, her voice cold and measured as she addressed him. "If you're lying, there will be consequences," she said, each word deliberate and heavy. "But if you're telling the truth, I'll find out." The room buzzed with a faint murmur of hushed conversations. Guests exchanged nervous glances, their unease growing with each passing moment. Victoria raised her hand, silencing them all with a single commanding gesture. She turned to the maitre d', her voice firm. "Stop all service. No one touches anything until I say so." The staff, wide-eyed and uncertain, froze in place. Waiters carrying trays hesitated mid-step, unsure whether to proceed or retreat. A heavy tension hung in the air as everyone turned their attention to Victoria, who now directed her sharp gaze toward the kitchen doors. "Bring the head chef," she ordered. The maitre d' nodded swiftly, disappearing through the swinging doors. The room fell into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the muffled sound of kitchen activity in the distance. Victoria's eyes never left Ethan, her expression unreadable. The boy, though visibly trembling, stood firm. He clutched the crumpled paper in his pocket as if it were his anchor, his resolve unshaken despite the weight of her scrutiny. Minutes later, the maitre d' returned, the head chef trailing behind him. The chef, a stout man in a crisp white uniform, looked flustered, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the room. His nervousness only heightened the palpable tension. "Chef," Victoria began, her tone icy yet controlled. "Who is in the kitchen tonight? Has anyone unauthorized been back there?" The chef wrung his hands, his gaze darting around the room as he answered. "Just the usual staff, ma'am." I can assure you. Before he could finish, movement at the back of the kitchen caught Ethan's sharp eyes. A figure, a young man in a sous chef's uniform, slipped out the kitchen door, his hurried steps almost imperceptible amidst the unfolding drama. But to Ethan, the sight was unmistakable. There! Ethan shouted, pointing toward the man. His voice rang out with urgency. That's him! He's the one I saw! The room collectively turned toward the fleeing figure. The sous chef's attempt to slip away unnoticed had been foiled, and now all eyes were on him. He froze mid-step, his face pale and drenched with sweat. The color drained from his cheeks as security guards closed in, their heavy steps echoing in the otherwise silent restaurant. Stop him, Victoria commanded, her voice sharp and unyielding. The guards moved quickly, intercepting the sous chef before he could reach the door. They seized him by the arms and dragged him back into the room, where he stood trembling under the weight of Victoria's piercing stare. His uniform, once pristine, now seemed to hang loosely on his trembling frame, and his hands fidgeted nervously at his sides. Speak, Victoria demanded, her tone cold and cutting. What were you doing? Why were you trying to leave? The sous chef stammered, his voice barely audible. I, I wasn't trying to leave. I just needed some air. Victoria stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. Don't insult my intelligence, she snapped. You were trying to escape. Why? What are you hiding? The man's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. His breathing grew rapid, his chest heaving with panic. Ethan watched intently, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment he had dreaded and hoped for, the moment the truth would come to light. I, I don't know what you're talking about, the sous chef stuttered, his voice cracked under the weight of Victoria's glare. I haven't done anything wrong. Ethan stepped forward, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. I saw you, he said firmly. I heard you talking about the poison. You said it would be quick, that no one would suspect anything. Stop lying. The sous chef's face turned ashen, his trembling growing more pronounced. The weight of Ethan's words hung heavy in the air, and the murmurs among the guests grew louder. Fear and suspicion spread like wildfire, the perfect evening unraveling before their eyes. Victoria raised a hand to silence the room. Her voice, now calm but deadly serious, cut through the noise. Enough, she said, her gaze locked onto the sous chef, her tone leaving no room for doubt. If you value your life, you will tell me the truth. Right now. The man's knees buckled slightly, and he let out a shaky breath. His eyes darted around the room one last time, as if searching for an ally, before finally dropping his gaze to the floor. His voice was barely a whisper as he spoke. I didn't want to do it, he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. They threatened my family. They said if I didn't, they'd hurt them. The room erupted in gasps and whispers, the shock of his confession rippling through the crowd. Victoria's expression hardened, but her voice remained steady. Who? She demanded. Who gave you these orders? The sous chef hesitated, his body trembling violently. Finally, he muttered a name, so quiet that only Victoria and the guards could hear. Her face darkened, the name confirming her worst fears. Take him away, she said coldly, her voice devoid of emotion. The guards obeyed, dragging the sous chef out of the room as the guests watched in stunned silence. The tension in the room was suffocating, the reality of the situation sinking in. Victoria turned to Ethan, her expression softer now but still unreadable. For the first time that evening, she spoke to him without the edge of suspicion. What's your name? She asked, her voice quieter. Ethan, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Victoria studied him for a moment before nodding. Ethan, she said, her tone firm yet kind. You've just saved a lot of lives tonight. It was as if time stood still in the lavish dining hall. All eyes were fixed on the trembling man in the chef's uniform. His shoulders sagged under the weight of guilt, his face pale, and his voice barely audible as he began to speak. I didn't want to do it, he stammered. They came to me weeks ago. A man. He knew everything. Where my wife works, where my kids go to school. He said if I didn't follow through, they'd hurt them. The room grew colder as his words sank in, leaving a palpable tension hanging in the air. A wave of gas rippled through the guests as they exchanged shocked glances. Some whispered in disbelief, others sat frozen, unable to process the revelation. I didn't want anyone to get hurt, the sous chef continued, his voice cracking. They told me it would just look like an accident, that no one would ever find out. Victoria Grant's face remained expressionless, her piercing eyes locked on the man. Her voice was calm, yet it carried an edge sharp enough to cut through the silence. Who are they? She asked, her tone unwavering. I want a name. The sous chef hesitated, his breathing uneven as he struggled to meet her gaze. Finally, he muttered a name under his breath, a name that sent a shockwave through the room. Gasps turned into murmurs, as those who recognized the name whispered it to others. It was a name synonymous with power and greed, the kind of name that evoked fear even in the strongest of circles. Victoria's jaw tightened. She took a step closer to the man, her voice dropping to a cold, controlled whisper. You chose to endanger innocent lives. And for what? To save yourself? Tears streamed down the man's face as he fell to his knees. I didn't know what else to do. They threatened my family. Please, I'm begging you. Forgive me. Victoria didn't flinch. Her gaze bore into him, unyielding. She turned to the security guard standing nearby. Call the authorities, she ordered. This man doesn't leave this building until the police arrive. The guards moved swiftly, hauling the sous chef to his feet. His pleas echoed faintly as he was led out of the room. The once bustling restaurant was now eerily silent, the weight of the confession hanging heavy in the air. Victoria shifted her attention to Ethan, who stood quietly, his small frame dwarfed by the opulence around him. His tattered clothes and timid demeanor seemed out of place in the grandeur of the dining hall, yet his courage was undeniable. You saved my life, Victoria said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. Without your warning, this could have ended very differently. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. I just didn't want anyone to get hurt, he said, his voice trembling. Victoria nodded, a faint smile breaking through her icy demeanor. And because of you, no one did. She turned to address the room, her voice regaining its commanding presence. Tonight, we've witnessed something extraordinary. Courage doesn't always come from where you expect it. Let this serve as a reminder to all of us. As the guests nodded in solemn agreement, the faint strains of music began to play again, signaling the slow return to normalcy. But for those present, this night would remain unforgettable, a testament to bravery and the unshakable power of doing what is right. The tension in the room began to dissipate as the sous chef was escorted out, his desperate pleas fading into the background. The once heavy silence was replaced by hushed whispers among the diners, a mix of shock and relief rippling through the elegant space. All eyes now shifted to Victoria Grant, who stood motionless, her sharp gaze fixed on the small boy who had turned her evening upside down. Ethan stood quietly, his small frame still trembling slightly from the weight of the night's events. The crumpled paper in his hand seemed even more fragile under the bright lights of the restaurant. Victoria's expression was unreadable as she stepped closer to him, her towering figure casting a shadow over the boy. You could have walked away, she said finally, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of curiosity. No one would have blamed you. So, why didn't you? Ethan swallowed hard, his wide eyes meeting hers. He hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words before his soft, shaky voice broke the silence. My mom always said to do the right thing, he said, his tone laced with innocence and courage, no matter how scared you are. He paused, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. And I thought of her when I saw you. Victoria's sharp demeanor softened slightly, but her face remained composed. Your mother, she asked, her voice quieter now, carrying a hint of genuine curiosity. Ethan nodded, his small hands fumbling with the paper he had been clutching all evening. Slowly he unfolded it, revealing a worn photograph. He held it out to Victoria, his voice trembling, as he continued. She used to work for your company, he said. Her name was Marie Collins. She said you gave her a chance when no one else would. She always believed in you. Victoria's eyes widened slightly as she took the photograph from his hands. It was a faded picture of a smiling woman with warm eyes, holding a much younger Ethan in her arms. For a moment, Victoria's cold, composed exterior cracked. Her fingers traced the edges of the photograph, memories flashing through her mind like a distant echo. Marie, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She knelt down to Ethan's level, her sharp, intimidating presence melting into something far gentler. She was one of the kindest people I ever worked with, always willing to go the extra mile. Ethan's lip quivered, but he held his ground. She talked about you all the time, he said. She said you were her inspiration, that if you could make it, so could she. Victoria's gaze softened even further, and for the first time that evening, the corners of her mouth curved into a genuine, faint smile. She looked into Ethan's eyes, seeing not just a brave boy, but the legacy of someone she had once known and respected. "What's your name, son?" she asked gently. "Ethan," he replied, his voice steady now, though his small hand still trembled. "Well, Ethan," Victoria said, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder, "your mother raised a brave young man. She would be proud of you." The room, which had been quietly observing the exchange, now seemed to hold its collective breath. The once intimidating billionaire and the small, tattered boy shared a moment of connection that transcended the opulence surrounding them. Victoria stood, still holding the photograph, and addressed the room. "Sometimes courage comes from the most unexpected places. Tonight, this young man reminded us all of what it means to stand up for what's right." The guests, who had been paralyzed by the dramatic events, began to nod in quiet agreement. A faint round of applause rippled through the room, growing louder as more people joined in. Ethan stood there, unsure of how to react, but a small, shy smile crept across his face. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as a homeless boy, but as someone who mattered. As the room settled into an uneasy calm, Victoria took a deep breath, her piercing gaze shifting from the murmuring guest to Ethan, who stood silently before her. His worn clothes and fragile frame contrasted starkly with the elegance of the setting, but his courage shone brighter than the chandeliers above. To everyone's shock, Victoria extended her hand toward him. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice carrying both warmth and authority, "why don't you join me at my table?" A collective gasp rippled through the room. Guests exchanged bewildered glances, their polished facades momentarily cracking under the weight of the unexpected moment. The maitre d' hesitated, as if unsure whether to intervene, but a firm nod from Victoria silenced any objections. Ethan's wide eyes darted between her and the luxurious table, laden with fine china and crystal glasses. "Me?" he stammered, disbelief coloring his voice. "Yes, you," Victoria said, her lips curving into a faint smile. "You've earned it." With hesitant steps, Ethan followed her to the table. The room's murmur quieted to an anticipatory silence as the boy climbed into the plush chair opposite Victoria. She signaled to the waiter, who placed a steaming bowl of soup before him. For a moment, Ethan simply stared, overwhelmed by the gesture. "It's okay," Victoria encouraged gently. "Go ahead." Ethan picked up the spoon, his hand still trembling, and took a small sip. The warmth of the soup seemed to spread through him, easing the tension that had gripped his body all evening. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of safety, a fleeting moment where survival wasn't his immediate concern. Victoria leaned forward, her gaze steady but kind. "You saved my life tonight," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "And for that, I owe you more than a thank you." Ethan looked up, his expression still wary, but softening under her genuine tone. "I just did what I thought was right," he murmured. Her sharp, business-hardened demeanor softened further as she studied him. "The world could use more people like you," she said, "and I'm going to make sure you have every opportunity to make that happen." The following day, Victoria's promise began to take shape. A sleek black car pulled up outside a modest shelter where Ethan had been staying on and off. He stepped out, clutching a brand new backpack filled with supplies, his eyes wide as he took in the unfamiliar luxury around him. Victoria stood waiting at the steps of a nearby school, her presence commanding but approachable. "Welcome to your first day of a new chapter, Ethan," she said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This is your chance to focus on your future. No more struggling, no more uncertainty, just possibilities." Ethan blinked back tears, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to thank you." Victoria crouched to meet his gaze, her own eyes glistening. "You've already thanked me, Ethan, by reminding me of what truly matters." As the school bell rang in the distance, Ethan turned to walk through the gates, his steps lighter than they had ever been. From the car, Victoria watched with a quiet smile, her heart swelling with pride and purpose. Narrator. In a world that often measures worth by wealth and power, it was a boy in tattered clothes who proved to be the richest in spirit. Victoria Grant may have saved his future, but it was Ethan's courage that had forever changed her life. As the morning sun bathed the city in its golden light, a sleek black car pulled up outside an elegant school building. The gates were adorned with vibrant banners, and the laughter of children echoed in the crisp air. Ethan stepped out of the car, clutching a brand new backpack. His once weary eyes now sparkled with a mixture of nervousness and hope. The weight of the world that had once pressed on his small shoulders seemed lighter. Dressed in freshly pressed clothes, he stood tall, looking at the school that symbolized a new beginning. He paused for a moment, taking it all in. The warmth, the opportunity, the chance to dream again. Inside the car, Victoria Grant sat quietly, her sharp eyes softened with pride. She watched as Ethan hesitated for a brief moment before taking his first step toward the school gates. He turned back, locking eyes with her, his expression a blend of gratitude and determination. Victoria rolled down the window, her faint smile brimming with warmth. "Go on, Ethan," she said gently. "This is your time." Ethan nodded, his small hands tightening around the straps of his backpack. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible but filled with sincerity. Without another word, he turned and walked through the gates, disappearing into the schoolyard. As Victoria's car began to pull away, she looked back one last time. Her mind replayed the events of the past evening, the warning, the courage, and the unexpected bond that had formed between two lives so vastly different. She had gone to dinner to celebrate her latest triumph, never expecting that the most important moment of her life would come from a boy with nothing to his name but his bravery. Narrator. One act of courage, one moment of kindness. It was all it took to change two lives forever. Heroes don't always wear capes or carry titles. Sometimes they come from the most unexpected places. A reminder that the smallest spark can light the way for a brighter tomorrow. As the car faded into the bustling streets, Ethan's story was just beginning, and Victoria's heart felt lighter than it had in years. Their paths had crossed by chance, but the impact would last a lifetime. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest power. Ethan, a homeless boy, stepped into a world far removed from his own, risking everything to warn Victoria, a billionaire, of an imminent danger. His courage and honesty exposed a dangerous plot, saving her life and reminding everyone that heroes often come from the most unexpected places. Victoria, once defined by her wealth and power, found her perspective forever changed by Ethan's bravery. In return, she ensured he had a home, an education, and a future he could never have imagined. This story is a powerful reminder that one act of kindness and courage can ripple through lives, creating change far beyond what we can see. If this tale moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Together, let's celebrate bravery, compassion, and the incredible power of humanity to inspire and transform.